Chapter 21. Coercive Recycling, Forced Conservation, and Free Market Alternatives. Chapter 21. Table of Contents. Some people get pleasure from recycling. That's fine, even if the impulse springs from the wrong-headed belief that recycling is a public service. Coercing people to recycle is something very different, however. Bet Bao Lord's description of forced labor recycling in China during the Cultural Revolution is instructive. One of the most frequent duties was to sort the city garbage dump. The job was a big one, and we were usually excused from school for the day. We had to sort the trash into piles of paper or leather or scrap steel, etc., which were in turn reprocessed for further manufacture. Another frequent detail was cleaning the streets of used paper and other litter. Each student was given a stick with a nail at one end for spearing and a paper bag for collection. After a day of this type of labor detail, I suffered from a backache. When the school collected all our full bags, it would turn them over to the factory for making new paper to ease the paper shortage. In poor societies, it may be worthwhile to recycle. But in China, people not only recycle because they are poor, they are also poor because they recycle. The recycling mindset in China in the late 1950s and early 1960s was inimical to economic development. The notion of making progress by forcing people to recycle when they could be doing more productive things makes societies poor. This mistake is sometimes compounded by the glorification of primitive production techniques, as Mao tried to do with backyard steelmaking and Gandhi with household textile manufacturing, rather than using the same amount of effort to learn how to do the work more efficiently and to gradually build a more modern system. The recycling mindset can also be counterproductive in rich countries. People praise saving trees by recycling newspapers, and they condemn those who cut down trees. But they do not cheer those who grow the trees in the first place, trees deliberately planted and grown to make paper. This is like praising people for saving a field of wheat by not eating bread while ignoring the farmers who grow our food. It acts to suppress the creative impulse. There is a further perversity in thinking here. People are focusing only on harvesting and death, not on planting and growth. It is much the same with respect to population growth, wringing of hands over someone who may die prematurely or unnecessarily, but no cheering of those who create and nurture new life. This is not to say that all recycling is misguided. Recycling is one thing when it is economically worthwhile for the person who is doing the recycling, but another thing when it is done purely for symbolic purposes, as now mostly in the United States. Please reflect on the fact that in our kitchens we voluntarily recycle ceramic plates, but not paper plates. Would it make sense to require households to recycle paper plates and cups by washing and reusing them? It would make no economic sense whatever, and it's doubtful that the paper could survive washing, though for some it might make symbolic sense. And those people are entitled, of course, to their private rituals. The logic is the same with community recycling. People voluntarily recycle valuable resources and throw away less valuable items that take more effort to recycle than they are worth. Coercive recycling is actually more wasteful than throwing things away. It wastes valuable labor and materials that could be put to better use, creating new life, new resources, a cleaner environment. Why do people worry so much about wastes? Why do so many people worry so greatly about what seems to be such an easy problem to handle, given time and resources? My best guess is simply that the worriers 1. Lack understanding of how an economic system responds to an increased shortage of some resource. 2. Lack technical and economic imagination, together. And 3. Harbor a moral impulse that says recycling is inherently good and we should be willing to suffer a bit for it. Let's touch briefly on all three. Lack of understanding of how a market economy works. Persons who are not economists, and perhaps especially those persons such as biologists who work with entities other than human beings, may underestimate the likelihood that people and organizations will make characteristically human adjustments to daily life and society. Such persons may then have too little faith in the adjustment capacities of human beings. Concepts that are appropriate for non-human organisms, niche, carrying capacity, etc., are inappropriate for the creative aspect of human beings, which is the central element in long-run economic activity. The 1960s and 1970s generalization of the work of Calhoun on Norwegian rats to policy recommendations for human society, see Chapter 24, has been a classic example of this muddle. For example, in regard to the possibility of fusion energy, Paul Ehrlich recycled his quote about energy in general by saying that cheap, inexhaustible power from fusion is like giving a machine gun to an idiot child. Presumably, the pronouncer of such pronouncements arrogates to him herself greater wisdom than the people being pronounced about. Garrett Hardin says, "People often ask me, well, don't you have faith in anything? And I always have the same answer. I have an unshakable belief in the unreliability of man. I know that no matter what we do, some damn fool will make a mess of it." This sort of thinking blinds one to the possibility that spontaneously coordinated market responses will deal with the wastes our society generates. Lack of technical knowledge or imagination. Many people who do not already know a technical answer to a given problem do not try to discover possible solutions, and they do not even imagine that others can dream up solutions. For example, when trains came along, some worried about the problem of providing toilets. Where would the wastes go? Then, when long-distance buses came along, people again worried because they knew that the ship and train solution, dump over the side or from the bottom, was not possible on the roads. Then some worried about the same problem in planes. Then, when the problem was solved for airplanes, the problem seemed insuperable in spacecraft. Yet in all these cases, the problem simply required some diligent thought and engineering skill. And so it is with just about every other waste disposal problem. But you are depending on a technical fix, some say. Yes, and why not? A technical fix is the entire story of civilization. Yet our solutions are not limited to the physical technical. New economic political arrangements can solve problems. How can a community reduce the amount of garbage that people put out? Charge households and businesses by the pound or the liter of waste collected. So it is for other waste problems too. Imagination and economic organizational skill are necessary. But there is every reason to believe that once we direct those skills to a waste problem, solutions will be forthcoming. The combination of technical imagination plus a free enterprise system constitutes the crucial mechanism for dealing with waste, turning something of negative value into something of positive value. Slag from steel plants was long thought of as a nuisance. Then there arose entrepreneurs who saw the slag as man-made igneous rock, harvested from blast furnaces, which could be used to provide excellent traction in road surfaces, such as the Indianapolis 500. And old railroad ties are not just clumsy chunks of wood to be burned, but now decorate retaining walls for lawns. The moral feeling about recycling. In a hearing on taxing disposable diapers, California State Senator Boatwright pointed to the committee members and said that they all raised our kids with cloth diapers. And you know, it didn't kill them at all. Got your hands a little dirty, maybe, but it didn't kill them. It's a hell of a lot more convenient to use disposable diapers. But you know what? You save a lot of money when you use cloth diapers. Like a fraternity initiation. I suffered. Why shouldn't you? When I tell my neighbor that I don't want to wash bottles and cans in order to recycle them, he tells me that it takes practically no time at all. But when I ask him, in light of his assessment, if he would regularly do the job for me, he demurs. Pros and cons of waste disposal policies. There are 3 ways society can organize waste disposal. A. Commanding. B. Guiding by tax and subsidy. And C. Leaving it to the individual and the market. The appropriate method depends on the characteristics of the situation and depends to a considerable extent on whether there are difficult externalities, effects that go beyond the individuals involved and that cannot be internalized, a rare situation. Almost all solid household waste is a perfect case for untrammeled free enterprise. Garbage is one of the easiest of waste disposal problems for society to deal with because there are no externalities that are difficult to deal with. In Urbana, Illinois, We had the best and cheapest garbage collection I have ever heard of, each homeowner contracting with any one of the private haulers who worked in the area. They gauged their charges according to how much garbage you put out, the standard rate being augmented by special charges for special hauling. If the service was sloppy or unpunctual, you changed haulers at the end of the month. The hauler, in turn, made a deal with a private landfill operator. The community could be neutral and inactive, and there were no significant externalities. There is no sound reason why such a system cannot operate almost anywhere. Problems arise when the community gets involved, either through contracting with a single hauler, or the municipality paying the hauler, or the municipality providing the service directly. There is then no incentive for homeowners to reduce the amount of waste they create, which leads to high waste output, and the community becomes subject to voters who have ideological views about waste and recycling, which distorts the best economic choice. And as a result of individuals' political values, together with their ignorance of the facts stated above, communities turn to recycling. There are two drawbacks to recycling. The first is that it costs the taxpayers more money, as noted below. The second drawback is that it usually injects an element of coercion, which is antagonistic both to basic American values as well as to the efficient working of a free market system. Both will now be discussed. The resource costs of recycling. Unnecessary recycling and conservation cannot simply be dismissed as a harmless symbolic amusement. There is a major cost in other activities that are foregone. People could be building instead of recycling, building roads, public buildings, parks, even improving their own private shelters and spaces. People's value for building may have been affected by the role of government. In the 8 years that I have lived in a suburb of Washington, D.C., we have had scores of people come to the door soliciting funds. Never once has anyone solicited funds for a building project. Never for trees to be planted, a cathedral to be built, or a concert to be given. Almost every solicitation has been for funds to lobby government to do something, and in most cases, a large proportion of the funds collected goes towards soliciting more funds to do the same thing. In decades past, it was not so. People solicited funds to build private hospitals and religious and cultural institutions and other great works for the benefit of the public. But now, people expect the government to perform those activities. Hence, funds are solicited mainly to bend the government's will to support people's private interests. If government did a better job in building and administering, perhaps there would be no grounds for complaint. But we know from much solid evidence that government performs these activities very poorly, at high cost, and with poor service. These are part of the costs of a conservation mentality, of saving whales and Chesapeake Bay. Another unreckoned cost is the coerced time of private persons. When a town calculates the cost of a recycling program, it ignores the minutes spent by householders in separating types of trash, putting them in separate places, and stocking separate containers, and learning where and when the various kinds of trash must be placed for pickup. These are non-trivial costs. The cost in coercion. As of 1988, 6 states had mandated household separation of types of waste, and as of 1991, 28 states have recycling or waste reduction quotas. As of 1990, the District of Columbia, like a large proportion of the 2,700 communities that have recycling programs, requires recycling of newspapers, glass, and metals in all apartment buildings. Not only does this law require individuals and firms to do what they would not do voluntarily, with fines for offenders, but it invites some of the practices of a totalitarian society wherein people are invited to meddle in their neighbors' lives. The Washington Post, one of the 3 national and international newspapers of the U.S., recommends that apartment dwellers first try peer pressure and then complain to authorities if the landlord does not recycle according to law. And there is provision to report scofflaws to the city's trash police, a team of 10 inspectors hired to search through trash and identify culprits. Not only are such practices odious, at least to me, but police expenditures are a high cost that surely are not included when an account is made of the total burden of recycling. Zurich, Switzerland has such a system in place. Inspectors will track down people who don't use the spiffy new sacks and hit them with fines. Collectors have instructions to search through any old bags left in the street for evidence that will identify offenders. An envelope with an address, for example, says Rudolf Walder, the city's garbage disposal czar. Then we will hit them with a 100 franc, $67 fine, and if they keep on doing it, we'll inform the police. Involvement of the government also opens the door to bureaucrats working to protect their own interests against those of the public. For example, in Loudoun County, Virginia, local officials have gone to great lengths to stop one businessman from composting some of the community's yard wastes, decaying them into a rich soil for forming. Public officials have opposed the operation, with regulations and even by sending local government landfill representatives to block the entrance to the site, on the grounds that it threatened the local government's landfill revenues. One of the sins committed by this operation is that it charges only $10 a ton to take in garbage, whereas landfilling costs $50 a ton. On a larger scale, the state of Rhode Island prevented a hauler from taking waste out of the state to dumps in Maine and Massachusetts. The state-owned Central Landfill is now the only licensed facility in the state, and its monopoly prices are higher than elsewhere. The state prevented the hauler from going elsewhere so that it would not lose the revenue. If a private firm were to somehow maneuver itself into a similar monopoly position, it could not use the law to keep customers from going elsewhere. Furthermore, the Federal Trade Commission would break up its monopoly. But government can get away with abuses that private enterprises cannot. The problem of junked abandoned cars is not well handled by the market, however. One knows in principle what should be done: create proper rules that will compel producers of the waste to pay appropriate compensation to those who suffer from the pollution, either as individuals or as groups, so as to internalize the negative externalities, as we say in economists. But crafting and legislating such rules is not easy. Friedrich Hayek asserts that this is the most difficult of intellectual tasks and the most important, and there often are strong private interests that militate against remedial actions. The outcome of this sort of pollution, then, depends largely on the social will and on political power, as well as upon our wisdom. Price and value. The most complex and confusing conservation issues are those that are dollars and cents questions to some people, but to other people are matters of aesthetics and basic values. Consider saving old newspapers in this connection. The waste disposal aspect of newspapers is discussed in Chapter 19. In some cases, it makes sense to save and recycle paper because the sales revenue makes the effort profitable. In World War II, the price of waste paper rose high enough to make the effort worthwhile for many householders. And where shredded newspapers are used as insulation after treatment with fire-retardant chemicals, paper collection can be a fundraising device for community groups such as Boy Scout troops. But nowadays, in most communities, the cost of recycling less the sales price of paper seems greater than the cost of landfill disposal or incineration. Indeed, the price is now negative. By 1989, the amount of recycled paper had grown so large that communities had to pay $5 to $25 per ton to have paper brokers take the stuff. Here we must consider, what is the economic meaning of the market price of waste paper? That price will roughly equal the price of new paper less the recycling cost of making the old paper like new. In turn, the price of new paper is the sum of what it costs to grow a tree, cut the tree, and then transport and convert the wood to paper. If the cost of growing new trees rises, so will the prices of new and used paper. But if the cost of growing trees goes down, or if good substitutes for trees are developed, the price of used and of new paper and of wood will fall. An increase in recycling also drives the price down, and that is what has been happening. The total quantity of growing trees has been increasing and their price falling, and the newspapers report the successful development of KNAF as a substitute for paper. So why bother to recycle newspapers? Conservationists, however, feel that there is more to be said on this matter. They feel that trees should be saved for reasons other than the dollars and cents value of pulp or lumber. They argue that it is inherently right to try to avoid cutting down a tree unnecessarily. This argument is based on aesthetic or even religious values. The conservationists believe that stands of trees are unique national or international treasures, just as Westminster Abbey is for Englishmen, and as the Mosque of the Golden Dome is for Muslims. Perhaps we can express this by saying that in these cases, even the believer who does not directly use the treasure is willing to pay, in money or in effort, so that other people, now and in the future, can enjoy the good without paying the full price of creating it. Additionally, there is the argument that even if future generations will be willing to pay the price, they will be unable to do so if we don't preserve it for them. Some people even impute feelings to nature, to trees, or to animals, and they aim to prevent pain to those feelings. There is no economic argument against a person holding these points of view. But neither is one person's aesthetic taste or religious belief an economic warrant for levying taxes on other people to pay for those preferences. If one is willing to urge that the community pay in order to recycle, it is useful to know the price that has to be paid. The state of Florida has promised to subsidize firms to produce products out of recycled material and then sell them to the state, which will guarantee to buy the goods. Florida is just one among 30 states that are willing to buy recycled products, mainly paper, that cost 5% to 10% more than comparable non-recycled products. For perspective, perhaps 3 to 5 years of economic growth are necessary to make up that much of a reversal in progress by way of cost increase and productivity reduction. The governor of Florida calls this a no-brainer for companies because it is so easy for them to decide that a guaranteed market makes sense. Sometimes an argument is made for conservation on the grounds of national security and international bargaining. It may well make sense for a country to stockpile enough oil and other strategically sensitive resources for months or even years of consumption. But these political matters are beyond the scope of this chapter and of the usual discussions of conservation. Conservation and the government system. Do our treasured resources fare better in a private enterprise system or a socialist centrally planned system? There is no evidence that public officials are better stewards of any class of property, including wilderness and parks, than our private owners. Witness the state of upkeep of public and private housing. Consider the private, not-for-profit case of Ravenna Park in Seattle, Washington, which was a public treasure from 1887 to 1925, selling admission to see the giant Douglas firs at very modest prices. Then the city took it over by legal action. The park fell victim to corrupt tree cutting for the sale of firewood. Government ownership permits overuse of resources not only because of common ownership, but also because of incompetent management. For example, government often sets the prices too low for such resources as boating use fees and timber and grazing rights. And as I am writing this, I read in the Washington Post that concessionaires at national parks gross millions of dollars using government-owned buildings, from hotels to boathouses. But the U.S. Treasury earns hardly a penny because it charges little or no rent. Low prices encourage heavy use of a government-controlled resource. The private market would not fail to charge and collect appropriately high prices for access to grazing lands, timber, and so on. I cannot prove that a combination of academics and politicians will never design a social, political, economic system that will better conserve nature and produce an aesthetic environment than will an undesigned system that relies upon people's spontaneous impulses and a market system governed only by very general rules. If any sentence in this book will be widely quoted, it probably will be that one, ungainly and dull as it is. I cannot even assert that each and every ecological feature would be better served in an undesigned system. It may be that if governments were not to preserve the giant pandas in zoos, the animals would die out. Indeed, no private firm now exhibits pandas for profit, though P.T. Barnum's great museum did this sort of thing. It might well be, however, that if government were not to do so, interested individuals might take steps to preserve the pandas through voluntary organizations. In the 19th century, when hawks were being shot as predators and were in danger of extinction, private individuals created a preserve that is now Hawk Mountain Sanctuary in Pennsylvania, which eventually became not only a preserve, but also a center for research on raptors. Nature lovers should not underestimate the likelihood that, in the absence of government action, others like them will act spontaneously to protect the values they hold dear. Indeed, that was the original nature of such organizations as the Audubon Society, before they turned much of their effort to attempting to increase government intervention. But government activity often drives out private activity, as government intervention in the provision of hospital services has reduced the role of religious organizations that built and maintained hospitals in earlier years in the U.S. The best evidence I can find is the data mentioned in Chapter 17, which shows that when the government completely controls, by ownership, the emission of pollution, the pollution is much greater than when the ownership is private, albeit with greater or lesser regulation. Now follows the general vision, which does not promise that every particular aspect of ecology will fare better than a planned system, but which does promise that, taking everything together, humans will prefer the overall outcome to the overall outcome of a system where officials plan and dictate how resources will be treated. Those who seek to plan our ecology argue that while markets may successfully bring us autos and tennis matches, markets fail with respect to wilderness, plant and animal species, and aesthetics of the landscape. In support of their vision of a designed system, they point to the slaughter of the buffalo and the passenger pigeon, the befouling of our rivers and lakes for many decades, and ugliness of some inexpensive housing developments. And they argue that humanity changes the planet further and further away from the pure, pristine world that they imagine existed before humans became many. In rebuttal, the free market environmentalists analyze such regrettable events and argue that the source of the destruction usually is a system lacking property rights that would prevent such events. And they point to countervailing examples: beef cattle preserved by individual ownership, facilitated by the branding system, and the barbed wire invented to resolve the problem of common grazing, the growth of elephant herds in Zimbabwe, see Chapter 20, the improvement over time in housing quality in most neighborhoods, even those like Levittown that were originally thought tacky, the habitat preservation on farms where owners sell the rights to hunt, the beauty of fishing streams in Great Britain which are privately owned or which clubs own fishing rights to, and the well-stocked fish ponds that sell fishing rights in old borrow pits by the sides of highways in Illinois, dug by the highway builders to get building materials. Free market environmentalists also cite the insults to human dignity and constraints upon individual freedom that planned conservation brings about: trash police, water cops, farmers being fined and going to jail for making their farms more productive at the expense of migratory ducks, neighbors and people's own children bringing pressure on homeowners to separate types of trash. These examples, and the theory behind them to be discussed below, are compelling, in my view. But as the designed system advocates offer counterexamples, the issue must also be discussed at the level of the overall vision, and the test is the analogous comparative experience of planned versus free enterprise economies. Common sense argues that specific planning for particular kinds of outcomes results in a better general outcome than an undesigned system. Yet the evidence is incontrovertible that with respect to ordinary economic matters, an undesigned free enterprise system does much better than does a planned socialist system. Investigations of the performance of socialist economies and the breakup of communism in the 1980s and 1990s entirely vindicate the theoretical visions of David Hume, Adam Smith, Karl Menger, Ludwig von Mises, and Friedrich Hayek. And even worse than the economic effects of a planned system are the effects upon human welfare in non-economic aspects, liberty and health, for example. See Chapters 17 and 22. Telling evidence is found in the economic comparison of North and South Korea and of East and West Germany, and also of Taiwan and China, discussed in more detail in Chapter 21. The communist countries use much more energy and produce much greater amounts of pollution, both per person and per dollar of GNP. One might say that this is because the communist countries are poorer, but this relative poverty is itself part of the story. Centrally controlled economies do less well economically, which is part of the reason they pollute more per unit of GNP and even per capita. The same sort of result would undoubtedly hold if the investigation were widened to include all countries, as Scully, 1988, has done for the effect of state system on per-person income. Before the 1980s, there was only anecdotal evidence for the comparative success of market-based decentralized systems versus centrally planned systems, just as there is today with respect to conservation and pollution of the environment. And the same kinds of commonsensical arguments for the advantage of a rationally planned system were given in favor of communism. Economies of scale, avoidance of duplication, control by the cleverest intellectuals instead of less educated ordinary persons, and so on. But the transformation of countries to a planned command and control system based upon this theorizing was demonstrably the greatest human blunder of all time. This is the same vision that leads to such an activist command and control approach as this suggestion for the Alaskan Wildlife Refuge. You drive a stake in the ground and say, "You don't cross the Canning River." It must be said, however, that if one wants a planet the way it was 20,000 years ago, not just stop the world I want to get off, but reverse the world to the way it used to be, a free society will not move in that direction. The only way to obtain that result is to kill off almost all of humanity and destroy all libraries so that the few remaining humans cannot quickly learn how to rebuild what we now have. If someone wishes this sort of conservation, no arguments are relevant. Some ecologists urge on us a mixed system where government only does what is necessary. It is impossible to disagree with this in principle, the panda being a case in point. But those persons should be aware that in the analogous situation of the mixed economy, almost all the activities that were regarded as necessary, government-owned steel mills and mines and telephone systems, for example, turned out not to have the desirable properties that in advance they were touted to have. The mixed system is mainly a mirage and an intellectual illusion, and sometimes a Trojan horse for wider planning. And the idea that government can manipulate prices to simulate a well-working market has in Eastern Europe been shown conclusively to be a figment of unsound theorizing. When the first edition was written in the late 1970s, the theoretical ideas discussed in Chapter 15 and above in this chapter had not yet been adopted by the federal government, and indeed were anathema to environmental activists. See the afternote to Chapter 15 on ecologists' criticisms of standard economics. And the first recourse of policymakers is still to command and control systems. For example, the state of Maryland plans to reduce air pollution by coercing people to drive less. The mechanism is to require all employers of more than 100 persons to provide free fare cards, grants to buy bicycles, subsidized carpools, flexible work hours, or greater opportunities to work at home, along the lines of the 1990 Clean Air Act, and of programs in Southern California, Seattle, Phoenix, and other cities. Since the 1980s, however, there has been growing recognition, even among non-economists, that direct controls are usually inferior to market-based economic incentives as ways to manage pollution. For example, the law now makes provision for firms, such as electrical utilities, to buy and sell rights to emit quantities of pollutants. The Chicago Board of Trade even has laid the groundwork for a public market in smog futures, along the lines of commodity and securities markets, and environmental organizations have approved. In the 1980s, these economic ideas were refined into a body of applied work. The free market environmentalist writers emphasize the concepts of property rights and of allowing price rather than command and control devices to allocate goods. They discuss non-market government failures as a counterpart to the market failures that many see at the root of pollution problems. The free market environmentalists point to the successes of market systems in the cases of conservation mentioned earlier in the chapter. Proven successes with market systems for controlling pollution are less conspicuous. But such conservation cases as private fishing streams may be seen as the opposite side of the coin from the issue of pollution in streams and rivers, where privatization of rights has been shown to be effective. If you want society to force you to waste effort and money because sacrifice is good for you, mandatory recycling fills the bill. But if you want people to have the best chance to live their lives in the ways that they wish, without imposing waste costs on others, then allowing private persons to deal with their private problems privately should be your choice. The key question for social decisions is how to get the optimal level of recycling and waste disposal, pollution, and environmental preservation with a minimum of constraint upon individuals and economic activity. Economic incentives working in free markets often are a better system than command and control. Aside from the economic costs of inefficient controls, there is usually excessive, overzealous coercion, as in the regulations that eventuated in King Edward executing the man who polluted the air with sea coal mentioned in Chapter 17, or the milder coercion of recycling zealots today. Additional discussion of this topic may be found in Chapter 30, Are People and Environmental Pollution,